And once again, I want to say greetings to each and every one of you, Aquaba, and welcome. Welcome to another round of the Conscious Roster Report here on LIV Radio, LIV TV, here on livinginblack.com. My name is Keedy Awadu, aka the Conscious Roster. Weekday mornings, you and I get together live. We come at you from 9 a.m. Pacific time. That's 12 noon Eastern Time, 5 p.m. GMT, and 8 p.m. East Africa Time. We get together with you, and we deal with culture, consciousness, historical perspectives, entertainment, economics, education, health, labor, law, politics, religion, family, conflict, future studies, all areas of human interactivity and development. Today's date is Wednesday, the 3rd of February. 2026 in the Western Gregorian calendar. This corresponds to the year 6266 in the Kemetic calendar, to which we've realigned our cultural clock. Welcome to the 7th millennium. You have found your family in a peaceful place here on LIV Radio, LIV TV, here on livinginblack.com. We've got a good show for you today. Let me tell you what's coming up. We are in African Our Story months, February and March. Here on LIB Radio, we're taking it to the next level, and we're going to feature 2 months worth of dynamic broadcasting here on LIB Radio. And what I'm doing during these 2 months is that I have been working very hard in the background to update and redo all of my online presence. It's a lot of work. I'm working every day, all day long, doubling and tripling my hours, but we're getting it done. So these months, I'm going to step through almost all of my Conscious Roster Report books. And we're also going to have a couple of guests intermingling in during this month as well. So it's going to be quite interesting. Today, the book Mau Mau. We're going through 2 books for African Our Story Month, the Mau Mau and Prisons. Today, the book Mau Mau recounts the 1950s anti-colonial uprising against British colonial rule in Kenya, highlighting land theft, brutal repression, and freedom fighters' unrelenting guerrilla resistance. It frames this as a pivotal struggle for African self-determination and a blueprint for many other liberation movements that followed. The second book we're going to examine today, Prisons, warns of escalating mass incarceration, targeting Black and underserved communities as a eugenics-driven agenda, despite falling crime rates, not failing, but falling crime rates. It went viral in the early days of the internet, with U.S. law enforcement agencies across the country contributing to its spread. Today, we demand community resistance to reclaim our human potential. So those are what we have on the table for today. The Conscious Rasta Report. This is our broadcast series. It's drawing on over 25 years, over 30 years now, of investigative reporting. We've cut through propaganda and misinformation to reconnect Pan-African diaspora communities with our heritage and consciousness. And for educated African Americans, African British, and diaspora-born Africans ready to engage and to leverage our acquired skills, resources, knowledge, the assets we've built up, we illuminate pathways to collaboration, identity reclamation, and prosperity for our mother continent. Together, we transform fear into action and fragmentation into collective power. So that's what we have on today. For today, we're going to go into the book Mau Mau. Kenya's Land and Freedom Army struggle. Let me see, I have this on my desktop. I have the green screen on, so it's cutting out part of the title. It's in green. Kenya's Land and Freedom Army struggle. And we have so many different ideas and quotes and themes in this. This is a quote attributed to Jomo Kenyatta. It says, when the missionaries arrived, the Africans had the land and the missionaries had the Bible. They taught us how to pray with our eyes closed. Then when we opened them, they had the land and we had the Bible. Jomo Kenyatta. Woo, that's a powerful theme. Very powerful theme. There's another quote that I have here. This is from me. Before the Europeans arrived, African societies, bear with me, I got to clear my throat. I just started talking today, so things be backing up. Before the Europeans arrived, African societies had means for self-governance that flowered from the wisdom of the elders in apportioning the resources of the society for all of its members. After the end of direct colonialism, they came with their so-called democracy. They have upset the self-governing order of our indigenous systems. Now they are bringing their money lenders and globalist corporations for another round of stealing power from our leaders. Once again, they have tricked us out of what took thousands of years to evolve. That is quoting me from 2001. And this book is very, very rich. I could almost just randomly go to any one given page and just start reading. But I'm going to begin with this chapter. This is not the first chapter. It talks about the first chapters. I talk about Arab, the geography and resources of East Africa, what it was that they were after. The second chapter deals with Arab exploitation and enslavement. The third chapter, I'm going to begin reading Europeans Scramble for East Africa's Wealth. In 1823, British naval captain William Fitzwilliam Winsworth Owen landed in Mombasa, Kenya's principal seaport. He confronted then ruler Sultan Said on the immorality of enslavement and offered protection of the British fleet in order for a promise to abolish the practice. Contrary to the expressed wishes of the British government, he raised the British flag for the first time in East Africa. In a dispatch to home officials, he wrote, quote, "It is to me as clear as the sun that God had prepared for the dominion of East Africa, for the only nation on earth that the public virtue enough to govern it for its own benefit, and for the only people who take the revealed word for their moral law. The British home government promptly canceled Wentworth's protectorate, but the period of European hegemony over East Africa was now underway. Significant to the early colonial history of Kenya is the British and German rivalry over control of East Africa. In 1846, two German Christian missionaries, Johann Riedmann and Johann Ludwig Krapp, traveled to East Africa and established the historical record as the first Europeans to have glimpsed Tanzania's Mount Kilimanjaro. In 1849, Mr. Krapp penetrated the interior of Kenya and witnessed Mount Kenya. The two explorers were nonetheless branded as frauds by the British Royal Geographic Society, skeptical because of descriptions of snow so close to the equator. In 1855, another German, James Ehrhardt, produced a crude map of the East African interior based on information provided by Swahili and Arab ivory traders. His map portrayed an island sea called Unyamwezi, beyond which he believed lay Africa's legendary mountains of the moon, as translated by the Egyptian-born mathematicians and geographer Ptolemy in his famous Geographica, dated 150 before the Common Era. This region being the twin sources of the Nile River, as well as the earliest known origin of humanity. Now again, much of what is being talked about here, Africans already had established. Obviously, Europeans didn't discover anything. Africans had been established across the whole of Eastern Africa, including the whole of the Nile River Basin and what is now known as Lake Victoria, for eons. So, between 1857 and 1877, a succession of European explorers entered East Africa searching for the elusive source of the Nile. They included Richard Burton, John Speke, David Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley, and Joseph Thomson, the latter accredited for instigating much of Kenya's British exploitation. At about this time, Mbatian, the Maasai's greatest prophet, predicted the imminent arrival of 3 plagues from the north, which would, by 1890, wipe out his people. He prophesied that these 3 horsemen of death were smallpox, rinderpest, as in cattle disease, and the white man with his treacherous nature. Wow, it's a powerful book. Yet the European incursion into East Africa was not easily accomplished. In 1881, the German Herr Dr. Gustav Fischer attempted a well-armed expedition. And bear with me, I have to do this. I have to put up another website here for today. Let me just real quickly, not a website, another stream for today, so I can monitor my Rumble family, monitor everyone checking in for Africa One. I see you, beloved, in the house. Brother Keedy, Hotep, Brother Keedy, and Global Allenby family. And I want to thank you for Africa One. Your donation today was perfectly timed. And this is going to work. We have this big master plan for 2026. It's all going to work. The ancestors are working behind the scenes to make sure everything lines up just perfect. And your contribution today was literally lined up perfectly. I do see you in-house. Flying Guillotine 2022 is on YouTube. Great to have you with us as well. I'm going to continue reading. I hope you love what I've written today. And I love this book myself, I tell you. And I did write about Mbatian, Maasai's greatest prophet, that predicted 3 plagues arriving in Kenya. 1 would be smallpox, 2, rinderpest, a cattle disease, and 3, the white man with his treacherous nature. Yet the European incursion was not easily established. In 1881, the German Herr Dr. Gustav Fischer attempted a well-armed expedition into the Kenyan interior, but was ambushed and repulsed by a superior Maasai force in a gorge called Hell's Gate. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, which we have now come to know was not the Berlin Conference. It was called at the time the Congo Conference. And I choose to, and I hope you agree, choose to call it not Berlin Conference, call it the Congo Conference, because they were there to divide up the rich African basin, the Congo Basin of Central Africa. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Congo Conference of 1884-85, organized by German Emperor Otto von Bismarck, formulated the wholesale colonial division of Africa. The conference, attended by 14 European nations and America, eliminated any remaining independent territories within Africa except for Ethiopia and Liberia. Liberia itself already a neo-colonial creation of the United States. In attendance were France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, Spain, the U.S., Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Sweden, Norway, and Turkey. That's 15. U.S. was in there as well. And welcome to the conversation in Nguvu. Sawubona, he says. My survival depends not upon the enemy not coming, but upon being prepared to receive him when he does, quote unquote. That's a powerful, powerful statement, brother. And I completely agree. As a result of the British partition, the British retained control over Kenya, Rhodesia, South Africa, Egypt, Sudan, Sierra Leone, Nigeria, the Gold Coast, Ghana, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and Somalia, and gained Uganda from Germany in 1890 because of that country's military troubles with France and Russia. On the other hand, for the Germans, the partition of Africa brought their hegemony over Cameroon, Tanzania, Southwest Africa, which is Namibia, Zanzibar, and Togo. And we should all know by now what the Germans did in Southwest Africa, aka Namibia, the German Southwest Africa. Their genocide is quite notorious. Little Belgium came away from the Berlin Conference with a massive and wealthy Congo, also known as Zaire at the time the book came out. For years, the Congo was ruled as the private fiefdom of the ruthless and tyrannical Belgian King Leopold II, who implemented perhaps the worst Holocaust of colonial Africa. Mark Twain wrote the book King Leopold's Soliloquy, which narrated the genocidal carnage in exquisite prose of this demonic reign. Further understanding Leopold's sadistic rulership can be found in E.D. Morel's Black Man's Burden, as well as King Leopold's Congo. Finally, for more shocking details, read the diaries of Richard Casement, who worked in the Congo for Henry Morgan Stanley and the African International Association from 1884. It has been estimated that at least 6 to 10 million African men, women, and children were brutally and sadistically tortured, maimed, and murdered to satisfy the Belgian king's colonial venture. The story of King Leopold's reign over the Congo is the definitive history of the absolute viciousness of European attitude toward Africans during the colonial period. Some would claim that remnants of that attitude persist today, but are merely acted upon much more discreetly. I'm going to skip forward. I'm going to read just a little bit more. Carl Peters, PhD, described as, quote, one of the most energetic imperialists of all time. Carl Peters, a German who wielded a mild-mannered, frail, and bespectacled appearance, it earned the reputation of Africa, of a ruthless and sadistic killer. He directed the German control of Tanganyika, which is now modern-day Tanzania. There was an intense contest between the Germans and British for hegemony over Uganda and the Lake Victoria. The African name for Lake Victoria is Lake Nyanza waters. An Imperial British East African expedition sent to Uganda to counter imperialist efforts by Peters was led by the legendary American journalist Henry Stanley. Eventually, the British gained control over Uganda due to Germany's troubles with France and Russia. Now, we're going to go to Kenya now. A significant development in the scheme to open up the interior of Kenya to European exploitation was the construction of the, quote, lunatic express, unquote, railroad into the Kenyan interior. This railroad, developed primarily to facilitate export of Africa's natural resources, was constructed using in part 28,000 imported Indian quote-unquote coolies at the cost of nearly 2,500 Indian laborers killed, reportedly including 28 of them eaten by lions. The Ugandan Railroad, completed in 1901, stretched a total of 581 miles and was instigated by a Scotsman, William McKinnon, to assure British control over the Ugandan headwaters of the Nile. The movement of British colonial forces over the lengthy rail line was a critical development toward militarily controlling the interior lands of East Africa. As did their Arab predecessors, they made alliances with certain African tribal groups during the process. Among the more notorious African allies of the colonists were Chief Murunga Kikomo, who, because of tribal rivalries, aided in the suppression of competing neighbors. Another ally in suppressing native populations was the spread of diseases imported from Europe. Writing about the brutal measures which were used to suppress African sovereignty over the prime real estate of East Africa, the British legal historian Sir William Harcourt, a professor of international law, is quoted, quote, "Every act of force you commit against a native within a sphere of influence is an unlawful assault. Every acre of land you take is robbery. Every native you kill is murder." I write, but toward the furtherance of colonial exploitation, his moral, ethical, and legal opinions were ignored, of course. European mercantile capitalists were enriched by the rape of Kenya, a wealth which persists to date in the economic institutions which either were founded upon or inherited this massive wealth. Chief among the successful colonial enterprises was the Imperial British East Africa Company, IBEA, founded in the 1880s by Sir William McKinnon. The IBA had its own flag, stamps, capital city, private army, printed its own money, and was the main capitalistic vehicle for the exploitation of East Africa. The enterprise largely funded and built the Lunatic Express in Uganda Railroad to transport its mercenaries into the interior toward plundering East Africa. So that ends that chapter. And I'm going to go quickly into the next chapter. We're talking about the indigenous peoples, so-called tribes of East Africa, the Kikuyu, sometimes referred to as Gikuyu. And their sub-tribes are the largest tribal grouping in Kenya, consisting of 4 principal language groups: Kikuyu, Meru, Chuku, and Embu. According to their tribal legend, the original ancestor of the Kikuyu tribe was Kikuyu, also spelled Gay-Kuyu, G-E-Y, Gayoko, whose 9 daughters gave birth to the ancestors of 9 clan lineages called Miheriga. The Kikuyu numbered over 1 million during the anti-colonial uprising, now referred to as Mau Mau. The Kikuyu tribe was noted for its elaborate military organization. Tactics included 1. The use of reconnaissance scouts known as Athigani, followed by 2, the advanced guard, the Mbutu, or Ingerewanil, who would penetrate into enemy territory, and 3, reliance on the rear guard, the Gitungati, the main force which would be waiting in ambush for counter-attacking enemies. The Maasai were the only tribe to often win battles against the Kikuyu's sophisticated tactics. The central area of Kikuyu land is a region known after British incursion as Fort Hall. The Kikuyu came into major conflict with the Church of Scotland in 1829 over their clan tradition of female circumcision before marriage and full womanhood, which was most likely a remnant of centuries of Arab influence. Disputes arose between traditional Kikuyu and Christian converts of the African Inland Mission, AIM, causing a split into 2 groups. Those called Aregi left the religious institution over the church's opposition to traditional practice, and the Kirore remained loyal to the African Inland Mission. Later, when the Mau Mau Rebellion broke out, the 2 opposing groups' loyalties were divided between the freedom fighters supported by Oregi and those loyalists whose members included Kirore. John Stone Kamau, who later changed his name to Jomo Kenyatta, eloquently defended the cultural practice of female circumcision in his 1938 book on Kikuyu culture and society facing Mount Kenya. Significant to an understanding of the forces which led to an eventual armed uprising against European colonists is the indigenous spirituality of the Kenyans. Tahu, translated as taboo, is the native Kikuyu spiritual thought. The Mundu Mugo is the medicine man. The Mganga, a diviner or prophesizer. The principal deity was Ngai, the divider. The story of how they came to possess the land is a fantastic tale of African spirituality, animist mythology, and esoteric symbolism, which explains the nature and soul of a wonderfully civilized and noble people. Other notable Kenyan tribal groupings include the Maasai and Somali, proud and fierce warrior groups with a long history of conflict with the Kikuyu. They frequently were allied with European colonial forces in suppressing other African clans. This brings to mind the inappropriateness of the adage, quote, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." Initially, the British, as the Arabs before them, feared these fierce warrior groups, yet were able later to subvert and co-opt them for imperialist purposes. Other large Kenyan tribes include the Jai Luo, also called the Luo, the second largest indigenous group behind the Kikuyu, the Akamba or Wakamba, also called Kamba, and the Abaluya, then referred to as Luya. There are 39 different language groups in Kenya and over 80 tribes. There are 39 language groups and over 80 tribes. Losing the land to white settlers. I'm not going to deal with that. Let's get to rebellion. I don't want to talk about, because the book it's very comprehensive. This chapter, losing the land to white settlers, and it talks about how they came in, how they got it. The next chapter, African grievances against the invaders. I'm going to skip over that chapter. Ooh, I can't skip over this. The fallacy of European, quote unquote, civilization and Christian benevolence became apparent in British colonial policy in Kenya. From the book, Nationalism in Asia and Africa, this is the story revealed. While Christian missionary effort has had little effect in the Muslim world or in India or the Far East, the case is otherwise in Africa, south of the Sahara. Here, Christianity was generally introduced to the African tribesmen simultaneously with European domination and the modern cash economy, Christianity. In its appeal to women and to the young, worked a disruption of the traditional tribal hierarchy in a way which its rival Islam, so clearly a man's religion, did not. Christianity, in forbidding polygamy, set itself up in radical opposition to tribal institutions. And that's another way of looking at why we see such an adherence in East Africa, and especially in Kenya. They love Christianity. And the women drive the institution wholesale, no doubt. While among the men tend to be Muslim. You will many times find a Muslim man married to a Christian woman as one of his wives. African grievances against the colonials. 2 paragraphs, and I'm going to go to the next. Colonials instigated forced taxation to implement the conscription of rural Africans into the labor market. Cash taxes were imposed on the natives' cattle, land, houses, and the people themselves. One second. In a social economy that had traditionally existed on barter and communal sharing, now cash currency had to be obtained by growing cash crops, laboring on European lands, on farms, railroads, or slaving underground in the colonialists' despicable mines. Whites unconsciously created within the Africans land and infrastructure to generate vast profits that allowed themselves leisured and enjoyable lives at the expense of and exclusion of Africans. Moreover, it caused a great resentment that would eventually explode into the violent fury of the Mau Mau rebellion. The next chapter deals with the role of Indians in Kenya, and from that original 32,000 strong coolie labor force, it has continued to this day, and Indian-owned farms in Kenya averaged 700 acres and were purchased for the paltry sum of about 7 British pounds per acre. I'm going to skip, and now we're talking about the organized evolution of the Mau Mau. And I'm going to have to go quickly through this chapter, but this is not too long a chapter. Organized evolution. The Africans of Kenya had a long history of resistance to the British colonization. In September of 1902, African rage over repeated settler offenses resulted in the brutal revenge killing of a settler. His captors staked him out to the ground, wedged his mouth open, and an entire village urinated in his mouth until he drowned. After this, the enraged Africans mutilated the corpse, cutting off the genitals, disemboweling him, and defecating on the body. But their satisfaction was short-lived. The British retaliated under the cruel command of Richard Meinerhagen by slaughtering every one of the men and women in the village, including elderly women. Meinerhagen participated in the massacre himself, reportedly commenting on, quote, how easily a bayonet entered the human body, unquote. The Kikuyu fought bravely with relatively primitive indigenous weaponry against superior British armament from 1890 to 1904. During that period, Waiyaki Hinga achieved superiority, notoriety, as one of powerful chief who led anti-European armed struggle. British retaliation during the rebellion killed more than 1,500 Africans, yet this phase of Kikuyu resistance persisted for as long as 15 years. Maasai warriors allied with the British to fight against the Kikuyu uprising. When this round of fighting ceased, more conscientious British observers made predictions that uprisings would become inevitable after a period of Kikuyu social and technological advancement. In 1904-1905, the Gusi and Nandi tribes rose up in rebellion, as well as the Giriama, who staged an armed insurrection in 1914. Toward further political awakening, the Young Kikuyu Association, the first post-colonial African political party in Kenya, was formed in 1922 by the 24-year-old Hani Thuku to protest against compulsory hut taxes, discriminatory labor statutes, the hated Kipandi Pass, which Africans were forced to carry in public, and other manifestations of European oppression. Thuku once accused the missionaries of spreading the word of the devil and invited all whites to get out of Kenya. Thuku was arrested shortly thereafter when a protest in Nairobi against a wage reduction, of which he was a principal organizer, drew gunfire from trigger-happy policemen and white settlers overlooking the demonstration, resulting in a significant number of Africans killed, estimated to be as high as 250. In March 1922, Thuku was deported to Kismayu in Somaliland. The Kikuyu Central Association, KCA, which was formed in 1925, petitioned the governor for the release of Thuku. He was eventually returned to Kenya in 1930 after pledging to cooperate with the colonial government. In 1934, Thuku formed the Kikuyu Provincial Association, which had the support of the tribal chiefs. In time, due to his newfound cooperation with the colonists, Thuku became a wealthy landowner, advanced himself as a farmer, and established a reputation as a political moderate who continued to collaborate with the government. He eventually became a prominent loyalist to the colonial regime during the uprising. In 1940, during World War II, 23 leaders of African organizations were detained under, quote, defense regulations, unquote, for allegedly covertly consulting with the Italian consulate in Nairobi. A copy of Mein Kampf, that's Hitler's book, found at the KCA headquarters, compounded the felony, resulting in the banishment of the organization. After the war, the development of a growing independence movement, there occurred a tremendous growth of trade unions, political organizations, labor strikes, and urban uprisings from 1947 onward. Among the chief Kenyan organizations were the Kenya Local Government Workers Union, later to become the Kenya Federation of Labor, under the brilliant leadership of the youthful under the 1953 declaration of a state of emergency. The largest of the nationalist organization, the KAU, was accused of being dominated largely by Nairobi-based Kikuyu, but the union was broad-based and actually had 7 of 9 of its council officers from other tribal groups. As well, the union had branches in Mombasa, Kilifi, Machakos, Kitulo, in Nyanza, Maasai Land, and the Rift Valley. The Kenyan African Union even presented a petition for redress of colonial grievance to the United Nations Assembly in Paris, 1951, led by Peter Mbiu Koinange. Peter Koinange is his name, Koinange, and Achieng Oneko. And that is also in 1951, the United States, Africans in the United States petitioned the UN in Paris with a petition called We Charge Genocide. And that appears in one of my books. I put the petition in the back of the book. It's that's in the book, The Repairing. Very important. I do see a comment for Africa One. Is this history taught in any public schools anywhere on the continent, as far as you know? No, I'm not aware that anyone is teaching this history. This is a very detailed history. I can recall being in conversations with numerous Kenyans, telling them this history, and they did not know it. So it is up to you and I to return to the continent to teach our people about our history. I didn't say their history. This is your and my history too for Africa One. In 1947, the KAU, Kenyan African Union, adopted the following Declaration of Aims. Point 1. That the political objective of the Africans in Kenya must be self-government by Africans for Africans, and that in that African state the right of all racial minorities should be safeguarded. Point 2. More African seats should be provided immediately in the Kenya Legislative Council, and the inequality of racial representation in the Interterritorial East African Central Assembly should be eliminated. Point 3, that more land must be made available both in the Crown lands and in the highlands for settlement by Africans. Point 4, that compulsory and free education for Africans, as given to the children of other races, is overdue and must be provided. Point 5, that the Kipande, the identification pass, with all its humiliating rules and regulations, should be abolished immediately. 6, that the deplorable wages, housing, and other conditions of African laborers should be substantially improved, and that the principle of equal pay for equal work be recognized. The KAU included amongst its prominent members Jomo Kenyatta, Bildad Kagia, Fred Kubai, who actually Bildad Kagia and Fred Kubai were the actual instigators, founders of the rebellion. Dedan Kimathi, the leader, General Dedan Kimathi, he led the rebellion. Eliud Mathu, Achieng Oneko, and Stanley Mathenge. Most of these would prove to be effective leadership of the Mau Mau uprising. Other notable trade unions included the Transport and Allied Workers Union, Domestic and Hotel Workers Union, and the Night Watchman and Clerical Workers Union. Tactics for increasing the pressure on the imperialist regime included boycotts of buses, beer, and cigarettes, as well as widespread Mombasa dock strikes, which took place in 1955 after the height of the emergency by the Dock Workers Union. The next chapter I'm going to skip over right now, the African soldiers' role in the two great European wars. Then we talk about the founding of Mau Mau. From 1947, as a result of the British colonial intransience and continued settler atrocities, the Kikuyu began to organize for violent resistance. Jomo Kenyatta, as leader of the Kenya African Union, needed the fledgling organization to expand, so he petitioned the assistance of Fred Kubai and Bildad Kagia, trade union organizers from Nairobi, to join the organization. Kubai and Kagia were actually the militants behind the effort toward arming for revolt, deliberately keeping the moderate Kenyatta in the dark. In KAU elections of 1951, the radicals took over the leadership and threw out some of the more moderate good boys, quote unquote. A land delegation to Britain, led by Peter Koinange and Oneko, was looked at as the last deputation, after which armed struggle was to be considered the only remaining option. Two parallel leaderships were established, the moderate KAU Parliament and the militant 30 group. Covert orders were sent out to acquire arms and munition. Because of a lack of international support, the rebels had to rely on stolen guns and assembling iron piping for homemade armaments. These munitions were stockpiled, and a counterintelligence organization was established to follow the moves of government forces. The original names for the organization were Muhimu, which is Swahili for important, Mwingi, meaning the community, the Kikuyu and Mumbi Society, Kikuyu Central Association, and, according to Eliud Mutonyi, chairman of the Central Committee, the Freedom Struggle Association. One significance of these titles is that it discounts European propaganda assertions that the struggle was a gang or a criminal organization. Eventually, Land and Freedom Army became the most common reference. Between 1947 and 1949, the use of the name Mau Mau was so common that oath administrators had to warn initiates that the organization that they had just joined was not called Mau Mau. Stories as to just how the land and freedom struggle became known as Mau Mau were varied, and none appears absolutely conclusive. In Kikuyu, Muma is an oath. There remain other possible origins of the name Mau Mau, including, number one, a sentry at a clandestine meeting who, upon spying the police, shouted Uma, Uma, a form of Kikuyu Pig Latin known to all Kikuyu children, which was intended to mean out, out. This was overheard and distorted to Mau Mau. And number two, an explanation from General China of a police interrogation of an oathed Maasai who pronounced Muma as Mu Mau, whereby the policeman wrote the word Mau Mau in his report. There remain other exploitations. And the next chapter is called Who Led the Freedom Movement? And I do talk about many of these leaders. We've heard many of their names so far, such as stated earlier, Jomo Kenyatta was falsely accused of directing the Mau Mau leadership, then passed on to Fanuel Odede, a Luau, and WWW Wari, who was a Baluha. But within the settlers conspiring, there were numerous plots to kill Kenyatta, including one attempt at Kololen Hall, Nairobi, and another murder attempt at the funeral of Chief Waru Hiu, whose assassination began the armed struggle. The principal organizer and leader of the Land and Freedom Army was Dedan Kimathi, praise be his eternal name. He was born October 31, 1920, Kimathi Wachiori, and later baptized Dedan near Mount Kenya at the village of Nyeri. In 1931, he was chosen to be the head of his clan, following a vision of his dying grandmother. He took this blessing as a sign by Ngai, which is their name for God, that he was the Kikuyu leader. From an early age, he was regarded as cunning, rough, treacherous, a prankster, quick-minded, and eloquent. all traits becoming a great leader. The British, in turn, called him a, quote, Hitler. As an illustration of Kimathi's ingenious, to pay his way through secondary school, he organized a night school where he taught other Africans what he had learned during the day. If they had no money to pay, he bartered for paraffin or soap, which he then sold at the local market. After 3 years, he enlisted in a more advanced school at Wandumbi. To pay for his school, he spent 2 days a week in the forest, collecting Grevillea robusta seeds that he sold to the forestry department. As a result, Kimathi gained much of his intimate knowledge of the forest areas. Later, Kimathi was schooled at the Church of Scotland Mission School. He spent 3 months in the army in 1941, discharged for insubordination. Still, he returned to school where he studied until February 1944, when administrators expelled him for refusing to pay the exorbitant school fees. And I go on and on and on. We're talking more about these leaders, and you need to know all of their names, but it goes many pages on. Let me just give you just 3. Fred Kubai, one of the founders, along with Bildad Kagia, was leader of the Nairobi branch of the Kenyan African Union. They were the actual militant organizers of the Mau Mau. They deliberately kept Kenya unaware of the evolution of militarism, as he was perceived by the British as a compromising leader and would provide a safe cover for the underground organization. Point. Bildad Kagia, disgusted with the behavior of the colonial church missionary society, he founded Dini Ya Kagia, an independent African church, after military service in the Middle East, England, and Europe. Tenets of the church included: number 1, independence from European domination; 2, sanctity from European abominations which had been offered to Africans as part of religious teachings; 3, a reformed African catechism suited to African customs and culture, which included re-baptisms and an African matrimonial society. And the other one I'll mention, there are so many. These are great, great historical figures. Oginga Odinga, a Luo who, though not part of the banned resistance, built upon his credibility with the indigenous Africans during the emergency, and is largely credited with keeping alive the name of Jomo Kenyatta at the time of his imprisonment during the crisis. When the Kenyan African Union leadership was arrested, largely through his work with various tribal groupings, Oginga became acknowledged as chief of the Luo Union. Oginga was later elected in the first black African elections to the Legislative Council in 1957. He led the effort to free Kenyatta and other nationalist leaders. Along with Kenyatta, Odinga formed the first independent government. In 1966, he broke with Kenyatta and Kenya African National Union and formed the Kenya People's Union as an opposition party to Kenyatta's rising despotism. Then we talk about many more of these names. Stanley Mathenge, you need to know his name, very important. It goes on. Chief Koinange was a very important figure as well. And the chief's son, Peter Koinange. This book is loaded. I'm not even halfway through it. We're going to have to wrap it up and get into the next. We do talk about the oaths. This is very important. This is long. This is the oath that they took when joining the Mau Mau, the oath of unity. Indemwa itatu. I speak the truth and vow before God and before this movement, the movement of unity, the unity which is put to the test, the unity that is mocked with the name of Mau Mau, that I shall go forward to fight for the land, the lands of Kirinyaga that we cultivated, the lands which were taken by the Europeans. And if I fail to do this, may this oath kill me. May this 7 kill me. May this meat kill me. I speak the truth that I shall be working together with the forces of the movement of unity, and I shall help it with any contribution for which I am asked. I am going to pay 62 shillings and 50 cents and a ram for the movement. If I do not have them now, I shall pay them in the future. And if I fail to do this, may this oath kill me. May this 7 kill me. May this meat kill me. And that was the oath of J.M. Kariuki Intongo. And there are other oaths, a lot of different oaths. I'm not going to read them all, but I do cite about 4 different oaths, including the 1952 Action Oath. And it talks about the soldiers. Well, let me read this one. It's not that long. I am sent to bring in the head of any enemy, and if I fail to do so, may this oath kill me. If I fail to steal anything I can from the Europeans, may this oath kill me. If I know of any enemy to our organization, and I fail to report him to my leader, may this oath kill me. If I am ever sent by a leader to do something big for the house of Kikuyu, and I refuse, may this oath kill me. If I refuse to help in achieving the Europeans, in evicting the Europeans from this country, man, may this oath kill me. Avenging, that was the word. If I worship any leader but Jomo Kenyatta, may this oath kill me. And it goes on. So the 4th 4-year state of emergency begins, responding to the bold assassination of the notable collaborator chief. The Nairobi roundup of dissidents and subversives occurred on October 20, 1952. Next date, I'm skipping forward. I'm not going to skip. A British battalion, the Lancaster Fusiliers, immediately flew into Nairobi from the Suez Canal zone. The aforementioned night of roundup of dissidents ensued. Before dawn, the colonial regime had arrested 83 suspected leaders without resistance. 2 days later, a second senior chief, a collaborator named Nderi, was hacked to death with pangas, which are machetes, by a group of 500 outraged Kikuyu. The Freedom Army commenced its offensive action with a series of notorious massacres on isolated settlers on remote farms. Early colonial victims included the Ferguson family killings on January 1st, 1953, the Ruck family, January 23, 1953, and Dr. Gray Arundel Leakey, a close relative to the family of the famous archaeologist. Another celebrated Mau Mau execution was that of Ian Makeljohn at Thompson Falls. And so the rebellion has begun. By January 1953, Africans are in rebellion. I then have a chapter, Colonial Tactics to Suppress Independence, very important chapter. The next chapter entitled, The Mau Mau Were True Nationalists. They were not criminals. They were not gang members. They were not just a group of thugs. Nationals, they were true nationalists. And I got to point that out. Atrocities committed by opposing forces. There were a lot of atrocities, including putting the people, the indigenous people en masse in prison camps, just like the Germans did. And we talk about the massacres. There's the Kagera River Massacre, where 94 newly recruited freedom fighters under General Kago's Mau Mau command were captured by Kenyan African KAR, which are collaborator troops, stripped of their clothes and machine gunned while white commanders looked on. 2 freedom fighters survived to document the massacre. Another incident occurred at Kagera River, where a different white officer ordered his Kenyan African I can't remember what KAR stands for. I don't have time to look it up right now, but they did much of the worst killing of Africans. These were African collaborator troops. Another incident where a white officer ordered his KAR troops to shoot all prisoners, including women. Routine torching of the homes of suspected sympathizers by the Kenya Regiment of the African Main Force. Frequent shooting or bayoneting of wounded prisoners, and the habit of throwing critically wounded prisoners of war in the back of a truck on top of a mound of dead bodies, many of whom died on the way to detention. The cutting off of hands and ears by British soldiers and mercenaries to be collected and traded as macabre trophies. Drunken British and settler soldiers on leave randomly beating innocent Nairobi citizens and robbing them of their valuables, and widespread rape by British, settler, and loyalist African soldiers against women not implicated in the uprising. So I'm going to go ahead to the second book here. Again, more chapters, the eventual suppressing of the uprising, and it talked about the aftermath, which Africans now come into leadership. I'm going to go into my book, Prisons, the Lockdown of Black, America's Futures. This pandemic of imprisonment of black men in America is pretty bad. Now, when I put this book out, I put it out on the internet and I made it widely available. And my beloved sister for Africa One another must have a book, give thanks. And I did send you the copy of the new book, but because of your actions today in making this book, helping me from going underwater and start to bounce checks, because that was going to cost me a lot of money, I'm going to send you a copy of Mau Mau, Kenya's Land and Freedom Army Struggle. So I'm going to go to Amazon. I'll do this after the show. .co.uk, and that way I'll know after the show to go ahead and I'm going to send you a copy, the print copy of the book. It won't be autographed, but it is a very good book. I'm going to go right near the beginning. Oh, when I put this book out, put it out on the internet, it was widely referred to, and this is the early days of the internet. It was widely referred to by law enforcement agencies across the country. I used to search for my own works, my books, where are they showing up? And I found out this book became very popular. And it's not that they critiqued it or criticized it or whatever, but law enforcement agencies were referring to this book so much. This book, Prisons, The Lockdown of Black, which has a database, significant database in the book that you could not get anywhere else. Trust me, I looked and looked and looked, finally I said, I got to create it. Then later, I started hearing from the government. I tell the story in the beginning of the book, the preface to the 2020 edition. Years earlier, I had twice applied for grants under the Public Corporation for the Arts. Twice applied, twice denied. The second denial even saw someone that I knew and trusted get a 2,500 PCA grant using my very ideas as his proposal. So therefore, I did not believe in funding from the federal government. Still don't. As I am writing in 2000, I just finished looking through bookshelves for 30 minutes. For 10 minutes, I found several of these solicitations from the U.S. Department of Justice, National Institute of Justice, along with more recently published examples of the research that they were seeking. I was offered a bunch of grants. The first grant they sent me was for $2,500. And then when I didn't respond, they doubled it. They kept doubling it. The last grant proposal they sent me was for $120,000 a year. as a researcher for the Department of Justice. I found the following, and I still have these. Solicitation for Research and Evaluation on Violence Against Women, fiscal year 1996. Solicitation for Policy Research and Evaluation, fiscal year 1996. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Program, Matrix of Community-Based Initiatives. A second program from that same office, Juvenile Offenders and Victims, 1996 Update on Violence. These are only part of multiple solicitations from the federal government, which were mailed to me referring to my nom de plume, my writing name, not addressed to the taxpayer name by which the federal government usually would be contacting me. This led me to conclude that it was this book, The Publication of Prisons, that brought me to their attention, at least outwardly so. I kept tossing these grant solicitations in the trash, although I did note that with each subsequent request, the grant offerings kept doubling. When these solicitations reached as high as $60,000 and later $120,000 annual research grants, I stopped throwing them in the trash. Somewhere buried in 23 years of accumulated papers in my library, I still have details of these requests. I still have them. They're around here. They're in the other room. I needed the money. Back in the late 1990s, this was a lot of money. Calculating the value of $60,000 in 1997, it would today be the equivalent of nearly $96,000. Not responding to a research grant offer of $120,000 for a year's worth of work, it would in today's dollars be turning down $191,000. What in the hell was I thinking? Today, I would probably take the money. I needed it badly then. I was married, had 3 children ranging in age from 3 to 8 years. My income from the music industry was downshifting to that of an author of books for blacks. Another way of saying that I was steadily going toward bankruptcy. If anyone needed such a cash windfall, I was indeed a candidate. Still, I held out largely for purely ideological reasons. As well, almost strictly ideological, there was a consideration that if I did take the money for 1 year, could I create a cash flow to keep up with my new level of expenses so that for the next year, I might not have to rely upon the DOD to issue me more grants? Not DOD, DOI, Department of Justice, DOJ, to issue me more grants. I knew of some of these African American perpetual grant employees, and I did not have a tremendous amount of respect for that process. So that's just telling the story of how I turned down the cash to keep my integrity. My integrity now burned a hole in my pocket. But I hope you do agree that it was worth turning down the cash. Do you agree? Let me ask the question. Do you agree with my turning down what would, as of 2020, be $191,000? Do you agree or disagree? I'm going to just put that question up on YouTube. I'm going to put that question up on Rumble. And for Africa One, wow, I must have that book. Give thanks. Give thanks. It's an absolute pleasure for me to send it to you. Chapter 1. I'm going to introduce the book from Chapter 1. This report was initiated in 1994 as part of an extended series of reports I called The Police State, America 1995. That group of publications detailed various aspects of the development of the sciences of population control It included reports on police and military technology. One sec. Ah, that is so good. Got that cayenne pepper in it. Wow, love it. It includes reports on police and military technology, changes in law enforcement, the judiciary, juvenile incarceration, along with other aspects of what I perceived were developments toward the wholesale restriction of specified targeted communities. I linked it to all social engineering resulting from national security policies, which were part of an evolving fascist ideology within American politics. The original title of this report, when released in October 1994, was America, the world's biggest prison. And at that title indicated, by the time this country had achieved the dubious record of the highest number of jailed citizens of any country on the planet, even more than such similarly oppressive nations like South Africa, Russia, and China. Today, some 2 years later, the trend towards incarceration have continued to swing further toward oppression. The rate of jailing is particularly bitter for the so-called minorities within America, in particular those of African, Puerto Rican, and Latin American descent. While the main focus of this report will be on the relationship between Africans and the American prison system, much of the enclosed text will be equally as relevant to the other non-white ethnic groups, those Spanish-speaking members and certain Pacific Islanders residing in the United States. Now, I'm going to skip forward from the introduction. But not wishing to trivialize or discriminate against other people of color. It is such a broad scope already examining the prison incarceration system in the context of the effect on the black community. And no one could deny that blacks in America have disproportionately felt the sting of the incarceration system. In this report, I wish to illuminate the following points, such topics as: point, the phenomenal increase in incarceration rates since the so-called civil rights movement. Point, the gross disproportion of Africans in the system. Point, trends in juvenile imprisonment. Point, women in prison. Point, jailhouse lifestyle. Point, the exploitation of cheap prison labor. Cruel and unusual punishment, quote unquote. Point, the role of drugs in the rapid expansion of prison populations. Point, the development of a prison construction economic windfall. Point, pointing out social trends such as poverty, miseducation, electronic media, and racism, which exacerbate the crises. Point, state-sanctioned execution. And next point, perhaps most important, the larger impact of generations of young people being removed from their duty as producers and defenders of their particular community. So all of those points we do have chapters on, and this book is rather lengthy. It's in a small text format, but there's a lot of pages in the new book. Today, this is writing in 1996. Today, between 56 and 68 million persons of African descent in America stand on the precipice of a future in which we will largely be irrelevant in domestic affairs, grossly impoverished, rigidly managed as a collective group, propagandized against as the scourge of the planet, and jailed at the highest rate of any ethnic group in the industrialized world. The net sum of all this negative development over the coming decades is that we stand to lose our place in the family of humanity. And because of deliberate policies of those managers of an American police state, the U.S. national security establishment, we are in actual danger of wholesale genocide and extinction. Later, I wrote a book in in 2020, called Fade to Black, the passing of a great race. Little did I know that some 24 years after the publishing of this book, how realistic that last paragraph would be. The net sum of all this negative development over the coming decades is that we stand to lose our place in the family of humanity and in the actual danger of extinction. I hope that this report will be of value to the political leaders, community activists, anti-incarceration organizers, and to those who find themselves locked in the belly of the beast, to youth at risk, to family members of prisoners, as well as to anyone who has the concern that this extreme targeting of ethnic groups for imprisonment is deleterious to a people's future. This is life-changing research. And somehow, somewhere in the larger text, all of these groups should find some enlightenment in this research report. According to my dire predictions, this trend toward wholesale incarceration of blacks, Hispanics, poor whites, and other undesired populations within America will not only continue, but worsen in the foreseeable future. This despite the apparent trend of declining rates of serious crime. I will attempt to illustrate that this is a deliberate and preconceived outcome, even though the implications of demonstrating that conspiracy go far beyond this one report. Those familiar with the Conscious Rights Report are aware that I have linked these ethnic and racial policies to the larger agenda of population control in an increasingly crowded and non-white global reality. Thus, I view the wholesale jailing of a significant proportion of the reproductive age youth of specific communities as instrumental in eventually lowering the rate of childbirth within that targeted community. In essence, what I am proposing is that we begin to look at the tendency to incarcerate large numbers of a population group as a demented form of birth control. Until black leaders, as well as those who lead other ethnic groups, begin to view this wholesale imprisonment as a form of population control and social engineering, I am convinced that they will continue to promote irrelevant proposals and political movements, or worse yet, advocate policies which are contrary to the best interests of their constituency. They didn't hear me. They didn't listen. They didn't read the book. A whole bunch of people read the book. Women's groups. I got offers solicitation for research. It could have been that was a fake out too. The book was promoted on numerous law enforcement agencies across the country. You can probably still today go search on the web, even though it's going to be, well, it's going to be what it is, and go search for prisons. I put the entire book up free on the internet. I put it up there free on the internet so that people in the system could get it. We're going to do better. Going forward, barring no interruption of these trends, which have become evident, within the coming decades, Africans in America will suffer the undue loss of community resources because so many of our youth and productive age population have been shackled, imprisoned, and shunted away to the fringe of society because of America's phenomenal rate of incarceration. This process must be interrupted before blacks can reclaim a sense of identity, a sense of destiny, and begin to raise the status of their demographic segment to enjoy the privileges and respect due to such a large group. I intend that this report will be significant toward that process. And I can recall for years and years and years, the book just would not move. It just went nowhere. Chapter 2 is entitled, Bring Back Them Old Slavery Days. Bring back them old slavery days. So yeah, it's back. The next chapter. Oh, let me just give you some of these bullet points. The disproportion. In this report, I'll point out certain subplots, such as the disproportion of blacks trapped within the corrections systems of the US, UK, France, and other countries. Point that harsher sentences melded out to blacks. 3, the growth of juvenile imprisonment, women in prison, jailhouse lifestyle, the exploitation of cheap prison labor. I talked about that earlier. Chapter 3, America, the world's biggest prison. The whole process of the jailing of vast numbers of a nation's citizens is a clear example of the level of, quote, civilization, unquote, or lack thereof, which is present within that society. Though the United States shamelessly boasts itself as, quote, leader of the free world and champion of democracy, a direct comparison between the U.S. and the prison systems of the other industrialized nations paints a radically different image. Without a doubt, America has only the brutal examples of the World War II fascist states, the excesses of Stalin's USSR, South Africa, and Zionist Israel as peers in the business of internal suppression of their dissident population, along with other undesirable groups. The climate of crime hysteria in the U.S. will make things dramatically worse over the closing years of the millennium. The immediate future beyond the year 2000 also appears bleak if one were to use the current rate of incarceration as an indicator. An opening quotation from Gunnar Myrdal's landmark and influential analysis, An American Dilemma, The Negro Problem and Modern Democracy, originally published in 1944 and republished in 1962 by Harper and Row, confirms that the disproportionate imprisonment of persons of African descent is part of a larger strategy targeting blacks for removal from American society. If I were to find any fault with Mr. Myrdal's quotation about mid-20th century American racial relations and their relevance to today's reality, it is within the first 4 words. There is no doubt. Within a large number of persons with whom I have conversed, there is doubt that the dominant population would harbor such feelings of resentment toward the presence of so many blacks within America. And that, you've heard me quote Gunnar Myrdal many times. America has already established the second highest rate of incarceration in the industrialized world, with a whopping 519 of every 100,000 persons in the U.S. being locked up in 1993, according to a September 94 report released by the Sentencing Project. This rate was 22% higher than in 1989 and 5 to 8 times higher than most industrial nations. The U.S. rate of imprisonment was exceeded only by Russia, 558 per 100,000, and was followed by South Africa, 368 under the white racist society policy of apartheid before the formation of the African majority government of Nelson Mandela. Mandela has subsequently increased the number of black South Africans who are jailed because of a rapidly increasing drug trade and subsequent increases in violent crime. This stood in stark contrast to other nations' rates, such as China, with 111 persons per 100,000, and at the other extreme, Sweden, with a minuscule 4 citizens jailed per 100,000. 4 compared to America's 519. Wow. For 1996, the rate of incarceration in the United States has accelerated its steady rise. The annual rate of increase in late 1994, 8.5% increase year on year, has now climbed to 9.7 per year, with the radical changes to the expected to be expected as a result of the new federal welfare guidelines passed in 1996, combined with harsh criminal legislative efforts such as, quote, 3 strikes and mandatory minimum sentences laws. This research indicates an alarming level of incarceration will definitely persist for the foreseeable future. Chapter 4, Increasing Incarceration in the United States, 1980 to 1994. Today, in 1996, the number of adults in jail within America stands at 1.6 million people, a staggering 623 of every 100,000 U.S. residents. According to LA Times writer David Lamb, in an article entitled Main Street Finds Gold in Urban Crime Wave, this has led to an economic windfall for a host of investors and speculators in the rapidly growing prisons industry. Of the phenomenal growth in prison populations over the past 2 decades, Lamb writes, and I quote, although Republicans and Democrats accuse each other of being, quote, soft on crime, the facts seem to indicate otherwise. The nation's prison and jail population, now 1.6 million, has tripled since 1980 and has grown so fast that one in 167 U.S. residents is incarcerated. If those inmates were suddenly turned loose on the job market, the unemployment rate would jump between 1 and 2 percentage points, economists say. A little statistic heavy over the next few pages, but I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs because these statistics do matter. I hope you do agree. Brother Shabaka, I see you in the house. Greetings, welcome. He says, I agree. Greetings, Baba and LB family. According to the article by Lamb, writing in the LA Times, David Lamb, the United States has undergone a prison building obsession unmatched in modern history. There are some 123 state and federal prisons that were either completed or under construction in 1996. Small communities are scrambling to attract a penal institution to their locale, along with the lucrative contracts for construction, servicing, and maintenance of the costly facilities. Also notable is the growth of profit-motivated prison operators. In a very real sense, prisons have begun to take on the image of the economic boondoggle that the defense industry assumed during the Cold War era. Times author Lamb points out that prisons have become a lucrative part of the $100 billion a year growth industry of crime fighting. He notes that nationally 4 jails open each month. The U.S. added 43,000 new beds in 1993. States engaged in the prison building spree are led by California, which is today in the midst of a $5.2 billion binge to construct an additional 51,000 beds. Texas is spending $1.5 billion. The bodies required to fill those beds are like chattel these days, with businesses scrambling to service the varied needs of the ever-swelling ranks of prisons, inmates, and jailers. According to all indicators, they are enjoying a lucrative investment. A significant U.S. Department of Justice publication was published in June 1996 and entitled Correctional Populations in the United States, 1994. The report traced the expanding population within the corrections system between 1980 and 1994, the period of the most phenomenal prison growth in U.S. history. By June 1994, the U.S. had a total of 5.1 million adults who were under some form of correction. This included some 3 million adults on probation, 992,000 who were in state or federal prisons, 484,000 in local jails, and an additional 690,000 on parole. As a percentage of the nation, this 5.1 million represents 2.7% of the U.S. adult population. In contrast, in 1980, the proportion of adults in the correctional system was 1.1%. In a mere 10 years, the rate of incarceration of adults in this country has increased 1.5 times. And then it gets real statistic heavy. I do have some charts, graphic charts, make it easier to kind of follow these trends along as time moves. And especially you see this chart over here, this list. These are ethnicity, imprisonment by ethnicity. And you know whose is the highest. You have all adults first, followed by the whites, followed by females, followed by, no, it was the males. The second one was the males, followed by females. And then the next one is for whites in the incarceration system. And then the largest one by far, blacks under correction. After no small amount of study, I have become convinced that U.S. prison census estimates of the total black population have become seriously undercounted for the last 4 decades. If what I have hypothesized is true, that the number of persons of direct African descent is as much as 111% higher than published figures, then this would significantly alter the rate at which blacks are incarcerated. I personally believe this to be the case, so that these escalated percentages, which are calculated upon artificially low census estimates, should reflect much less of a shocking increase. Nonetheless, there are far, far too many people who have been drawn into the penal network. So at that time, I was also recalculating the population of black people in America, and a radical change. Let's go to the latter parts of the book, because I put up a number of different chapters for solutions. Chapter 5 is entitled Juvenile Detention Grows Up. The next chapter, that's a lot of information. A couple of bullet points. A few examples of America's tragic reality follow. Point: arrests for violent crime among 14 to 17-year-olds rose 47% from 1989 to 1994. That's a 5-year period, rises 10% per year. According to the RAND report, a previous study from the same group estimated that the state's 3 strikes legislation might be able to produce a 21% drop in serious crime in California, but it would come at a frightening price. Enforcement of the law would cost $5.5 billion per year. For that amount of money, you could pay the young people to stay out of the system. Has this massive reinvestment in the imprisonment of youth paid off? Figures for juvenile arrests in 1995 do suggest a 2.9% drop from the previous year for violent offenders between ages 10 and 17. Yet criminal acts by juveniles, such as aggravated assault, robbery, rape, and murder, remain outrageously high. Why? Because the videos at the time, the imposing video culture was programming the youth to want to engage in these behaviors. A DOI report, Department of Justice report, DOJ report from August 1996 noted a decline in youth arrest rates for various categories, including number 1, murder, peaking at 14.4 arrests per 100,000 in 1993, dropping to a rate of 13.2 in 1994, and 11.2 in 1995. Murder rates had grown substantially since 1983, so they were returning to normal. Point 2, overall juvenile violent crime cases had fallen from 527 per 100,000 in 1994 to a rate of 512 per 100,000 in 1995. Point three, in California, the rate of juvenile arrest for violent crime was 656 per 100,000 in 1990. But that record rate had been reduced by 1994 to just under 622. And pages and pages and pages of these bullet points with statistics. President Bill Clinton's 1994 legislation, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, contained provisions for trying juveniles as young as 13 in federal courts as adults for violent crimes such as murder, assault, robbery, and rape. While anyone would certainly deplore such behavior by children, nevertheless, this is further evidence that America as a society is barbaric towards its wayward children. This nation has to acknowledge that its policies created, sustained, and expanded the miserable social conditions by which so many youth have become so ruthless. Upon examining the broad impact of juvenile corrections, along with the shocking expansion of the system over the past 2 decades, in particular its disproportionate effect on minority youth, one could determine that the immediate future looks bleak for this country, especially within inner city communities. Then the next chapter 6, women in prison. I don't like glossing over these chapters. Each one is very important because it tells the whole story. Women in prison. For women, as with other segments of the population, the statistics for imprisonment have also reflected terrible growth. Though women are far less a proportion of the whole correctional population, about 15% of the total of 5,129,700 under incarceration in jail, state, or federal prison, parole, or probation. Growth over the last 2 decades in the number of adult females under correction has mirrored that for the larger society. The Department of Justice places the number of female adults under correction for years end 1994 at 762,200. This figure stands at nearly 1 out of 7 of the total of the overall population under correction. The number of imprisoned adult females in the U.S. during 1994 was 105,800. The number of women in jail during a critical period of expansion between 1985 and 1994 was from 40,600 to 102,700, an overall increase of 152%. The ratio of incarcerated females was 53% white to 47% black in 1985 and 49% white to 51% black in 1994. Yet when one looks at the rate of incarceration as it differed between white and black women, for December 94, the white woman had a 1 in 7 chance, a 1 in 1,667 chance, 0.06% of being in jail, while according to the DOJ, the black woman had a 1 in 230 chance, 0.44%, more than a 7-fold increased risk of becoming incarcerated. That's a lot. It goes on, and then start to talk about, well, the economy and the women in prison. It goes on. The chapter has a lot of significant details. Number 7, jailhouse correspondence. For years, I have collected correspondence from dozens of men and women in prisons throughout the country. Among my collection, of which I take great pride, is one entry from one of my heroes, Yahweh Ben Yahweh, who wrote me from Pennsylvania. I've always tried to respond to each letter as circumstances would allow. From these letters, I have gotten a sense of the frustration that brothers and sisters are feeling because of their current lockdown. Many of them are quite good at conveying their thoughts on paper. I make it a point not to inquire as to the offenses for which they were convicted. I do my best to always mail some published reading material to those letters I respond to, usually sending a few prints of the many articles I've written. Occasionally I'll post books, cassettes, videos, whatever I can spare at the time. They make it through, and the recipients always love getting such items when they make it through censorship. Occasionally some materials are blocked by prison authorities. Much depends on the security level of the facility where they are imprisoned and the strictness of the policies of administrators. Some of the restrictive policies which frustrate the process include a ban on certain types of political-oriented material. Packaging requirements, i.e. cassettes, must be shrink-wrapped. Potentially provocative content. One cassette was rejected because it had a brief reference to the trial of O.J. Simpson and the origin of the material. Several of the inmates with whom I corresponded became extremely frustrated with what they determined to be particularly antagonistic behavior from judicial and correctional authorities on themselves, including restricting participation in progressive organizations. And I did include one of these prison correspondences that I got. One such brother incarcerated at Allenwood Federal Correction Institute at White Deer, Pennsylvania, wrote me a poignant letter in July 1994. He expressed deep frustration with the Federal Department of Justice regarding what was, according to his analysis, deliberate and systematic racist oppression against black inmates by the U.S. judicial system. And here's his letter in part. He addressed me as Mr. President, and I was, of course, head of Conscious Rasta Press. May peace be upon you and the guidance of the one God. It is my hope that this letter arrives to find you, your family, and your staff doing well. This is a follow-up letter to the letters written to you previously concerning the flagrant excesses of the U.S. Parole Commission, in conjunction with certain members of the federal branch, vented against the legitimate rights and expectations of African black Americans in the status of parolees. Since somewhere around the mid-1980s, the U.S. Parole Commission has deliberately pursued a policy of routinely violating the statutory and constitutional civil and citizenship rights of Africans, blacks, held captive under their sway. They have deliberately pursued a course of legal action that is patently illegal. And the letter goes on and on. It actually takes up 2 full pages, and I don't have time to read it. It was written to me by Jeffrey M. Hill. He wrote, justice is being routinely denied. Africans, blacks are being routinely discriminated against. I urge you to take steps to remedy this matter. Justice delayed is justice denied. And please do get the book, read the letter. And that's the only letter I included in it. Next chapter, 8, exploitation of cheap prison labor. The next chapter, hunting season, prison shootings by officers. And that is very, very scandalous. Next chapter, chapter 10, $1 billion prison building boom we talk about. And I'm going to skip forward just to chapter titles. Chapter 11, cruel and unusual, inhumane prison life. And the next chapter entitled The Drug War and Incarceration. That's a very, very important chapter. You have to understand the drug war was really about a move to imprison as many people as possible. And in this chapter, I did include the following. In February 1996, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the conviction of 3 Rastafarian residents of Montana should be overturned based on the trial judge improperly barred evidence of their religious views. For many Rastas, the use of cannabis in religious ceremonies is fundamental to the practice of their religion. It is so illustrated in the Christian Bible, which many, but not all, Rastas hold dear. According to Genesis 1:12 and Psalms 104, chapter 1, verse 12, and Psalms 104, that the use of such religious sacrament is consistent with the federal 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This law was passed to correct a 1990 Supreme Court ruling letting stand the prosecution of Native Americans for the use of peyote, a longtime component of their religious ceremonies. The 1993 law requires compelling justification for any prosecution that substantially burdens a defendant's exercise of religion. A lawyer with a DC-based Common Sense for Drug Policy stated, quote, "This is a legitimate issue, religious issue for Rastafarians. They can't reach an appropriate religious state without ganja. It's like taking the wine out of the Catholic Church." According to an Associated Press Newswire account, the court ruled that Rastafarianism, which originated in Jamaica, considers marijuana to be a religious sacrament that brings the believers closer to divinity and enhances their spiritual unity. This ruling could have a significant impact on the status of thousands of prisoners throughout the nation convicted for possession or cultivation of cannabis. And so that's just that, because I put that in there as a solution. If a person convicted for cultivation, not distribution, or for consumption, then that was their out. So, chapter 13, Dark Alliance, CIA cocaine smuggling. And we talk about Gary Webb's article series in the Mercury News called Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion. And that led to a massive increase in incarceration in America. Very important story. Chapter 14, the U.S. execution protocol. Chapter 15, social trends intensified the crises, etc., etc. And that takes you to the last chapter of the book, which is entitled Chapter 16, Jailed Youth, a Stolen Future. Jailed Youth, a Stolen Future. I want to thank you for being patient with me today. We did go a little bit over time, but I think it was really well worth the effort. We are learning so we can teach. We teach so that we will know. We know so that we can grow. I'm going to invite each of you, please, please, please do consider. I want you to go to my website, which is the Conscious Rasta Press.com. I'm going to put up that link here. And where are we at? Behind that at. I'm going to put up the link to the website, Conscious Rasta Press. Where is it? Here it is. I'm going to put up this website. Please do check out my new website. I'm very proud of it. I've been working on it every day for hours and hours. Please check out the website and today's featured books at ConsciousRastaPress.com. It's HTTPS. So I encourage each of you, do support us. Please do support this broadcast. And do what you can do. I know it's tough. It's really hard for me, and I'm making the assumption that's been tough and for each and every one of you as well. So I'm putting up that link on the websites. I thank you for tuning in. The YouTube, we didn't hear much from you today, but I know you were in the house. I think you were in the house. Let me double check over here and see how many of us were tuned in from the YouTube. I did hear from those of you on the Rumble and the Rumble family have been wonderfully supportive over some time. And let me turn this off. Okay. You and I, we are on track. We're doing something absolutely magnificent. We are moving towards a destiny that we can be very proud of. But we got to persist. We got to keep it up. We have to put in the effort. The people across East Africa for the Kikuyu Mau Mau uprising. It wasn't just the Kikuyu, it was a number of different groups. They rebelled, they persisted. What was done to them was as bad as what was done to the Germans did against all of their political enemies, economic and political enemies. We have it real easy. And it's been said that easy times make for a soft public, until finally the soft public allows things to get much, much worse for members of the group. And therefore they get tough again. Well, let's say we're getting tough right now. We're going to win. We have no choice. We have no choice but to win. You've been tuned into your favorite. We aim to be your favorite. We are LIB Radio, LIB TV. We are living in black.com. Thank you for tuning in today. And I'm out of here for right now. We're going to be back again tomorrow. We're going to be featuring 2 more books. I'm going to temporarily, I may not sustain the classes we're doing, but I may just adjust the classes to reflect what is in the books as well. On your favorite. We aim to be your favorite. We are LIB Radio, LIB TV. We are living in black.com. Peace and prosperity to each and every one of you.